On the morning of December 16, 1944, the dense forests of the Ardennes exploded with gunfire and engine noise. Hitler's last gamble, the Battle of the Bulge, had begun. Among the spearhead units was Kampfgruppe Peiper, a battle-hardened column of SS tanks and armored vehicles led by Colonel Joachim Peiper, one of the most ruthless and ambitious commanders in the Waffen-SS. His orders were clear: drive west, break through the thin American lines, seize the Meuse River bridges, and open the road to Antwerp. Hitler believed this offensive could divide the Allies and force a negotiated peace, but even before it began, Peiper knew his chances were slim. His tanks, Tigers, Panthers, and half-tracks were running dangerously low on fuel. The German army's supply lines had collapsed months earlier under relentless Allied bombing. Every drop of gasoline had to be stolen, captured, or rationed. As Peiper's column moved through the smoke-choked roads of Belgium, engines sputtered, trucks stalled, and soldiers began siphoning fuel from disabled vehicles. The men pressed on, cold, exhausted, and hungry, their breath freezing in the morning air. Then, on December 17th, near a small Belgian village called Honsfeld, Peiper's advanced scouts reported something almost unbelievable: an abandoned American fuel depot, untouched and overflowing with supplies. Peiper couldn't believe his luck, but as he soon realized, what they had found wasn't just a temporary salvation. It was a revelation of something far more devastating. The village of Honsfeld lay quiet under a thick layer of snow, its streets littered with wrecked American vehicles and scattered equipment. When Peiper's men entered, they expected another skirmish, maybe a brief fight before moving on. Instead, they found silence. The U.S. troops stationed there had withdrawn in haste, leaving behind weapons, rations, and, most importantly, fuel. Down a narrow road, past a row of burned-out jeeps, Peiper's lead unit stopped in disbelief. In front of them stood a cluster of steel drums and tank trucks, rows upon rows, over 50,000 gallons of American gasoline, stored in perfect condition. The men cheered. Mechanics rushed forward, siphoning and pumping fuel into empty tanks. For the first time in days, the German engines roared back to life. Soldiers filled their canteens with coffee from American field kitchens, laughed, and shouted that luck had finally turned in their favor. But Peiper stood apart, silent, watching the operation. He knew logistics, and what he saw disturbed him. The sheer amount of fuel left behind told a story no officer wanted to admit. The Americans had so much supply that they could abandon thousands of gallons without consequence. In Germany, entire divisions sat motionless for want of a few barrels. Here, on one snowy Belgian hillside, lay more gasoline than his Kampfgruppe had received in 6 months. Peiper muttered to one of his staff officers, "This is no victory. It means we've already lost." The men didn't understand what he meant, but Peiper, looking at the endless drums of American fuel, saw the truth Hitler refused to face. Germany was fighting an enemy that could never run empty. For a few precious hours, the mood inside Kampfgruppe Peiper lifted. Engines that had coughed and stalled all morning now thundered with renewed strength. Mechanics worked feverishly, refueling tanks and half-tracks under a gray winter sky. Drivers grinned for the first time in weeks, and officers spoke of reaching the Meuse within days. The captured American gasoline seemed like a gift from fate, a brief reward after months of retreat and scarcity. Peiper ordered his men to move fast. Every moment spent at Honsfeld was a risk. By nightfall, the columns rolled out again, engines burning American fuel as they advanced deeper into enemy territory. Yet even as they moved forward, Peiper's thoughts darkened. His staff officers reported that roads were jammed with wrecks, bridges destroyed, and resistance growing stronger. A light aircraft, grounded by bad weather, would soon return to the skies. Peiper's own maps were outdated, and communication with higher command was nearly gone. Still, they pressed on, because turning back meant death. That night, Peiper's convoy stretched for miles, headlights dimmed, tires grinding through slush and ice. The smell of gasoline hung heavy in the air. To his men, it smelled like hope. To Peiper, it smelled like irony. The scent of American abundance keeping a dying German offensive alive for one more day. By the next morning, the euphoria had faded. The roads west of Honsfeld grew worse with every kilometer, narrow, frozen, and clogged with vehicles. Peiper's tanks consumed fuel faster than it could be transferred. Within hours, his logistics officer warned him that, even after the American find, they would run dry again within a day if progress didn't improve. Peiper climbed out of his tank and stared down the snow-covered road, listening to the rhythmic thud of engines and the occasional crack of distant gunfire. His men trudged past, weary but obedient. What haunted him wasn't fear of the enemy, it was the realization of scale. Had seen the abandoned American depot, the trucks, the untouched supplies, and he had heard from prisoners that the Allies were already building new fuel dumps, just miles behind their front lines, stocked from an endless flow coming from ports and pipelines stretching back across France. Germany had nothing like it. The Luftwaffe was grounded for lack of aviation fuel. The once mighty panzer divisions had become dependent on captured resources. Peiper knew the math. Even if his unit reached the Meuse, it could never stay there. He turned to his adjutant and said quietly, "We are fighting an enemy who can waste what we cannot even imagine possessing." That night, his men refueled again, burning the same gasoline that had once powered American tanks. They were advancing toward their own exhaustion, chasing an illusion of victory fueled by the very empire they sought to defeat. By December 19th, Peiper's column had fought its way to La Glise, a small Belgian village surrounded by hills and dense forest. Snow fell heavily, muffling the distant sound of artillery. The tanks were running, but barely. Their fuel gauges hovered near empty again. What had begun as a lightning thrust was now crawling forward through mud and ice. Peiper's men were exhausted. They had driven, fought, and refueled in near constant motion for 3 days. The once disciplined column had turned into a procession of limping vehicles, and soldiers scavenging whatever they could find. The captured American gasoline had carried them farther than anyone expected, but it was running out fast. At La Glise, they found no more supply dumps, only wrecked vehicles, frozen corpses, and a handful of terrified civilians. The Americans had pulled back to regroup, but their air power was returning as the weather cleared. Peiper ordered a short halt. Mechanics drained the last reserves from trucks and staff cars, funneling every drop into the tanks. Soldiers huddled by small fires, eating from captured American ration tins, some joking bitterly that they were now fueled, fed, and clothed by the enemy. That night, Peiper wrote in his field notebook, "The men still fight bravely, but the war is lost, not because of courage or tactics, but because we no longer possess the means to move." He didn't share those words with anyone. To his troops, he was still the Iron Commander leading them west. But inside, he already knew. Honsfeld hadn't been a turning point, it had been a revelation. Germany's might was gone, and their future now ran on borrowed American fuel. By December 21st, the illusion of momentum had completely vanished. The Allied counterattack was underway. American forces, freshly resupplied and reinforced, began tightening a ring around Peiper's isolated spearhead. Communications with German headquarters were cut, fuel was nearly gone, and temperatures plunged below freezing. At dawn, Peiper's Panther tanks tried to move out towards Stoumont, but several engines sputtered and died after only a few hundred meters. Mechanics banged on frozen fuel lines in vain. Others tried to siphon the last drops from abandoned vehicles. The roads behind them were blocked by wreckage and ambushes. Retreat was impossible. From the surrounding hills, American artillery began pounding the village. Shells screamed overhead and exploded among the parked half-tracks. The men scattered for cover, but most stayed calm. They were veterans who understood what it meant to be trapped. Inside a stone farmhouse turned command post, Peiper spread a map across a table lit by a flickering lantern. His staff stood in silence as he traced a line from La Glise back to the German border. It was broken in half a dozen places, every road cut, every bridge destroyed. He looked up and said flatly, "We are encircled. The offensive has failed." No one answered. Outside, American machine guns chattered in the distance. Inside, Peiper sat motionless for a long moment before closing the map. The same man who once led Germany's fastest armored thrusts now commanded tanks that couldn't move an inch. Machines of steel and fire turned into silent monuments to a dying empire. The next 2 days were a blur of snow, smoke, and shellfire. La Glise became a fortress, the last island of Peiper's once powerful Camp Frupp. The Americans tightened the noose with infantry, tanks, and artillery, firing day and night. The air filled with the sound of engines, but they were no longer German. Allied tanks prowled the hills, their supply lines running smoothly, their fuel limitless. Inside the village, Peiper's men fought from cellars, church towers, and frozen fields. Ammunition was running out, and food was scarce. Every tank lost meant another immovable wreck blocking the narrow streets. Yet they refused to surrender. By December 23rd, Peiper's column was broken. He ordered the destruction of all remaining vehicles, including the heavy Tiger tanks that could no longer move. The men poured the last barrels of captured American gasoline over their machines and set them ablaze. The flames lit the snow in shades of orange and black. A grim reminder of how far they had come, and how far they would never go again. As the vehicles burned, Peiper turned to his adjutant and said, "This is the end of our steel, the end of our road." That night, under the cover of darkness, he led about 800 survivors on foot through the forest toward the German lines. They carried their weapons, wounded comrades, and memories of a campaign that had begun with ambition and ended in revelation. That the war was not just lost, but unwinnable against a nation that could outproduce, outfuel, and outlast anything Germany could imagine.